Hi, while the slides are being put up, I would want to introduce myself. I'm ORLY Vardeny, and I'm at the Minneapolis VA and the University of Minnesota. And I only have one disclosure, which is that I'm a first-timer to these meetings. And so I'm coming into it blind, per se, but I'm going to try to make it as applicable to this particular workshop as possible. But to do that, I think it's important to set the stage. So the trial that I'm going to talk about is the influenza vaccine to effectively stop cardiothoracic events and decompensated heart failure. And my first slide is kind of the background rationale. Why is this important? Why is influenza important? And we're all familiar with the fact that this past year was a particularly virulent influenza season that led to highest numbers in terms of mortality and secondary pneumonias compared to the seasons previous to that, up to 2014. And in general, influenza leads to significant morbidity and significant mortality, lots of hospitalizations. And what we started to examine or become interested in was the fact that several analyses have documented a temporal association between influenza infection and cardiovascular events. And so the next question was, will a vaccine that is purposed for reducing influenza infection, will it reduce cardiac events? And part of our initial or preliminary analyses or preliminary data were this meta-analysis of 6 randomized trials showing that influenza vaccination compared to no vaccination led to a reduction in major adverse cardiovascular events. Now, this is the only test tube slide I'm going to show. I'm going to go over it very quickly. Now that we have accepted that influenza vaccine may reduce cardiac events, how do patients with cardiac events respond to the vaccine? Or what is their immune response of how well it's going to work and protect them? And so some of our preliminary work showed that patients with heart failure in particular did not mount as good of an immune response compared to people without heart failure. And that's seen on the left panel. So our next question was, well, if we double the dose of influenza vaccine and compare to standard dose, can we overcome that blunted immune response? And the answer was yes. So higher antibody responses in terms of blood content of antibodies in patients that were randomized to double dose compared to the standard dose. And again, in a meta-analysis, a more potent vaccine also trended or led to a more significant reduction in cardiac events. And this is in non-cardiac patients. So then our next question was, okay, we know that patients with cardiac disease may mount a better response, but will that translate into improved outcomes? And just to preface by saying that the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, who makes recommendations to the CDC on what vaccines we should use, does not preferentially recommend one vaccine type over another, whether that is standard dose or high dose. At the moment, just most importantly is to get vaccine. So we aim to study a randomized trial, or we designed a randomized controlled trial looking at high dose trivalent influenza vaccine compared to standard dose quadrivalent influenza vaccine. What is the difference between the two? The only main difference that's of relevance is that trivalent has 3 viruses or antigens in the vaccine, whereas standard dose has 4. So why do we compare high dose, low dose, tri versus quad? The reason is that standard of care, we needed to choose a control arm that mimics standard of care as much as possible. And in the US, more and more of us are moving to standard dose quadrivalent as standard of care. So 1-to-1 randomization in about 9,300 individuals. This trial is ongoing over 4 influenza seasons. And the follow-up is up to 4 times a year by phone only, with a primary endpoint being the composite of death or cardiopulmonary hospitalization. So we wanted influenza vaccine as an intervention is fairly pragmatic. It's a once-a-year intervention. And we followed folks not with visits, but with just phone calls that we did at a week for tolerability and then several times in the year to assess for hospitalizations or death. So getting to the blinding, the trial was double-blinded, so blinded to participants as well as to providers. So the vaccine was provided to us from Sanofi Pasteur, and it's provided as individual dose syringes. And the syringes look similar, but they have some differences between them that allow a person could tell potentially which treatment arm they were allocated to. So we blinded through over-labeling of the study syringe. And because we knew that there may be tolerability differences between high dose versus standard dose vaccination, high dose we know hurts more going into the arm compared to standard dose. So we asked that the person that's vaccinating, the study team member that's vaccinating, not be the same person the person that's performing the ascertainment phone calls later on in the season. So why did we decide to blind? We could have had a much more pragmatic, to play devil's advocate, blinding delays us by 2 to 3 weeks each year. So we're just about to start our third year of enrolling participants. And when vaccine gets to our third-party vendor for blinding and then goes to distribution, that takes a bunch of weeks during which influenza vaccine is available to the general public in pharmacies. And every day that vaccine is available to the public is one less day that it's available in terms of having a study participant that's eligible to participate in the trial. So blinding does delay us by at least a couple of weeks, but we felt that the differences in the tolerability between the vaccine doses was one reason that we decided to blind. And then what about perceived differences in efficacy? So the high dose vaccine is only FDA approved right now in individuals age 65 or older, and we were studying all adults regardless of age. And there is a thought, even though the CDC does not recommend high dose as standard for people over 65, there are some that might think that people over 65 should just get that automatically. Again, that's not in a guideline, but the perceived differences in efficacy, I wonder, or we wondered whether patients would opt to receive or opt to go on open label study vaccine, whether the participant themselves, if they knew what they were on, are they more or less likely to go to the hospital with an acute decompensation of heart failure? Is an investigator more or less likely to hospitalize them, knowing the treatment? So that really is the reason for blinding in this particular study. I think we could have gone either way, and I think it'll be an interesting discussion, see what folks think one way or the other. Thank you.